Good.
Yeah, I'm good. Yes, all good.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
okay.
Should we start?
No, we go, wait another 5 minutes.
Oh,
Because there's some sort of thing coming.
All right,
We
good.
always have stragglers.
All right.
We rarely get started before a few minutes or so.
All right, good. Then I'm just gonna look at, make sure I've got all my slides in order.
Let's put that off just.
Prova. Prova, 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 prova. So we switch it off and ce ne mette un altro di microfoni a gelato.
Sì, condivido.
Are you sure? And the end, were there other questions?
She goes.
Okay.
Lascia stare, lascia così.
Put that off now.
Okay, so now it's off. Okay.
Va bene, okay. All right. It's showtime. Institute of Florence. Cherry darvi il benvenuto e adesso parlerò in inglese perché inglese is the international language of the institute here. So for that fellow Italian, I'm just giving the traditional welcome to everybody to the British Institute of Florence. I'm Simon Gamble, I'm the director of the institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for this week's Wednesday lecture. As is my custom, I will say a couple of words about the things that are coming up next before I introduce tonight's speaker. So next Wednesday for the Wednesday lecture, we're delighted to welcome Fabrizio Ricciardelli, who is the director of the Kent State University Study Abroad program here in Florence. And Fabrizio is also a serious and important scholar of the Renaissance, and he'll be talking to us about the rise of the Medici, about violence as a political tool in the Quattrocento. And then the following week on Valentine's Day, the 14th, we're having the next in our occasional series of jazz concerts. So jazz Albitis in the music Albitis season, a Florentine jazz pianist called Stefano Marizzi, who makes lovely soulful fusion music, and a slightly different arrangement to our normal practice. We'll start with wine on Valentine's Day to get everyone in the mood at 6:30. And then the concert itself starts at 7. And not to forget that next week we start again the month-long History of Art Renaissance course, Renaissance Florence. And you can sign up for the whole 4 weeks or 1 week, or you can drop into individual sessions. And there's embedded in the course, there's a whole lot of really good visits out and about to important sites and museums, including the Academia. I should welcome the director of the Academia here tonight, Titila Holberg. Welcome, Titila. So you can sign up for those sessions. It's all on the website. Also, the next cycle of Italian group courses starts on Monday. So as always, there's plenty going on here at the British Institute Library. So tonight's speaker, Elaine Ruffolo, hardly needs much of an introduction. She's been in Florence, she tells me, for 30 odd years. So straight after primary school, she moved here. And she's a well-known figure in the history of art scene, international history of art scene here in Florence. well known for many lectures and conferences, and sits on the Friends of Florence board and all these kinds of things, and also does the top end of guiding for select customers and all the rest of it. And on Sunday evenings, she has her very own series of Zoom lectures about all things Italian history of art. I think your current cycle is all about Venice in the next few weeks. And we've got some details about that also embedded inside the What's On. If you're not getting the What's On, please give us your email so that you can get your Monday morning newsletter so you know what's happening here. And so that's Elaine, and she's going to talk to us about the Young Michelangelo. I give you the microphone.
Thank you so much. Okay, grazie, Simon. Thank you for inviting me to the British Institute. It's really a pleasure to be back. I haven't been here for, about, I think, 10 years. And it's wonderful to see familiar faces and old friends and the director of the academia. So I better be really good, is for sure. Thank you for coming, all of you. And those of you who are coming in on Zoom, enjoy this presentation on the young Michelangelo. And I chose this topic because I thought it was unusual. We so oftentimes concentrate on Michelangelo from the David all the way to the Last Judgment, but not so much do we concentrate on Michelangelo as a young man, where he came from, what we know about him. And more or less, Michelangelo's career can be divided up into three sections, more or less 30 years, from his birth in 1475 to which we'll call his young apprenticeship. Then in the middle years, when, of course, he's hitting the high Renaissance, to the last 30 years, when he is looking forward even to the Baroque during his Mannerist stage. And I thought it'd be interesting for us to organize it as so. We're going to take a look at the written sources. What do we know? How do we know it? Michelangelo's early years, of course. Then I want to talk a little bit about Florence around 1475, a period that we can call the golden age of Florence. Michelangelo as apprentice, of course, Lorenzo the Magnificent. We got Savonarola in the story, and he takes off for his first Roman sojourn. I go pretty quick, and I'm going to give you a lot of information, and you'll let that wash over you, and then we'll pick up with Q&A afterwards. So let's have a look at Michelangelo Buonarroti, who was, I guess, universally known as the greatest artist of them all. He was an extremely, supremely gifted sculptor, painter, architect, and also, little known fact, a great poet. And he was highly successful financially. He made so much money that for the next 300 years, the Buonarroti family did not have to work. He invested heavily in real estate, and when he died, he was easily a millionaire. I know that for sure because my old professor, Rab Hatfield, found his bank accounts in the Florentine archives about 15 years ago and found that Michelangelo was extremely wealthy. And if you think about Michelangelo, he almost single-handedly lifted the status of artist from craftsman, about the same level as a shoemaker or a carpenter, to the level of artist, which could correspond to a writer or a poet. And he lived this epic life, and his works were also epic. Just think about it, everyone. The Sistine Chapel, the ceiling, the Last Judgment, his project for the facade of San Lorenzo, his project for the Pope Julius II tomb project, for which we have some of those statues at the Accademia, the course also at the Accademia, and he watched the rising up of the great church of St. Peter's. He also, this epic quality of his life, would really diffuse into his personality, his monuments, and then we have to realize that he lived during this golden age of Florence with other contemporary artists, which surely inspired him, influenced him. He didn't always get along with him, but looking at this on your upper left, I can see Andrea del Verrocchio, Filippo Lippi, Ghirlandaio, Palazzo, etc. And of course, the elephant in the room, Leonardo da Vinci, who surely must have inspired Michelangelo, even though they had a contentious relationship. To consider about the life of Michelangelo is that he was alive during the period that Italy was a patchwork, like a quilt of independent, self-governing city-states during his youth. By the time we get to the end of his life in the 1560s, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation had come on the scene, and look at the political situation significantly changed by the end of his life. He lived, as Confucius would say, was either a curse or a blessing in most interesting times. That is during this golden age where he was a protege of Lorenzo the Magnificent and was friends with two Medici popes, Leo X and Clement VII. And sets us up for this idea of his epic life. And we're going to concentrate on the very first part of his life. So, what do we know and how do we know it? And we look at the written sources of Michelangelo to understand how we have the information we do. And we know quite a bit about Michelangelo. Because rare thing, two biographies were written about Michelangelo during his lifetime. And the first, and perhaps the most important for an art historian, is the great Giorgio Vasari, who wrote something called the Vitae, the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects. And of course, he dedicates it to Duke Cosimo de' Medici, but he's going to place the Florentine artists at the apex. And at the apex of the Florentine artists will be the great Michelangelo. He mentioned, of course, Masaccio, Brunelleschi, Leonardo, most of whom are Florentine, but always the apex Michelangelo. Now, for some reason, Michelangelo didn't love that version by Vasari. So he decides that it has to be rewritten by his assistant, whose name is Condivi. So he, almost just 7 years later, writes the life of Michelangelo. And, it's more or less an autobiography with a ghostwriter, Condivi. Michelangelo makes the corrections that he wanted to. He wants to make sure he's putting himself in the very best light possible and looks quite heroic, and Condivi follows suit. And those two primary sources are invaluable for understanding the great Michelangelo. Condivi was a painter. He thought he was a great painter. I beg to differ. The other source, of course, of understanding Michelangelo's life is through letters, poems, and ricordi. So Michelangelo wrote over 1,400 letters. Interesting, back and forth to family members, to patrons, to other. And these are preserved. Interesting as well, because everything he wrote once he became famous was preserved as if it was written by a saint or royalty. We have, as I mentioned, Michelangelo was a great poet. Ricordi are documents. Sometimes he could have a document of the bank accounts that he might keep, or so we really have an idea about Michelangelo. Putting that all together, the two primary sources, ricordi, poems, bank accounts, gives us a clear feeling of understanding of what Michelangelo was like. Go to the source and you're confused about Michelangelo, there's always last resort. Just in case. Anyway, let's turn and take a look. Now, Michelangelo, again, we know a lot about, and we know Michelangelo Buonarroti. His last name is Buonarroti, which is already in and of itself interesting. And his family comes from Florence. So here's the city of Florence, about circa 1475. The city of Florence in 1475 must have been an incredibly interesting place because it dropped down to a population of about 40,000 people, which means that everybody knows everybody. And Michelangelo's last name indicates that he was of certain status. Otherwise, most people in the 15th and 16th century were called, like Giovanni Paolo, John Paul's son, or you might be called after the place where you grew up, Leonardo da Vinci. Sounds grand, doesn't it? It simply means Lenny from Vinci, like Elaine from Milwaukee. Big deal, no? And called by your father's profession, Antonio di Pola. Everything's more beautiful in Italian, but it simply means Andy the chicken seller, right? And as I said, but the fact that he was Buonarroti tells us that there was a certain status to the family. And even though they had status, the Buonarroti family were always on hard times. The father, Lodovico, was always trying to suss out a job. He didn't want to work below him. He had a hard time holding a job. I guess the Brits would call it genteel poverty. And this is Florence again in the 15th century. Now, at some point, Lodovico managed to get his hands on a job in a far-flung region up in the Casentino, not too far from Arezzo, called Caprese. And it's a little village where Michelangelo was born. His father got the job there as a podesta, which could be translated as mayor. But again, this is a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere, just outside of San Sepolcro. Has anybody been to San Sepolcro? Okay, maybe 20-minute drive, maybe even less. You can get to Caprese. And I can guarantee it is no great shakes. Michelangelo's father was the mayor of Caprese. As my good friend Alexander Lawrence once said, that means he was the mayor of Goat Town. So what was ruling Goat Town, Michelangelo was born. And Michelangelo was the second son of 5. His mother had 5 children in 8 years. And of course, she died. No wonder. But after his stint as podesta, the family, Michelangelo as a child, a baby, they're going to move to the city of Florence. And as any family with some status would do, they send the baby off to be wet nursed. Okay, Michelangelo was sent off to a little village called Settignano. I imagine most of you in this room have heard of Settignano. Maybe you've been up there. It's beautiful. And you can see from my slide how close Settignano is to the center of Florence. I guess you could walk from the Duomo to Settignano in about an hour and a half or so. And it was famous for, of course, stone. And that's what you see in the lower right-hand side. Big stone blocks made of pietra serena, that beautiful gray stone that's ubiquitous in Florence. And this is where the stone carvers worked. Desiderio da Settignano, for example. And Michelangelo was sent up there as a baby, and he was breastfed by a stonemason's daughter. And according to Michelangelo, when Vasari asked him about that, he said, is because I received the knack of chisel and hammer through the milk of my wet nurse. Love that story. In any case, you can imagine that it must have inspired Michelangelo. Here's a romantic 19th century image of the young Michelangelo carving away like one of the stone carvers in Settignano. So then from there, he moves back with his family. By this time, his mother's gone. He's one of 5 boys. The older brother ends up becoming a monk. So the responsibility of being the breadwinner after the father, we know is not a hard worker, really lands on Michelangelo. This is where Michelangelo is given an education. And keep in mind, friends, that Florence in the 1470s and 80s and 90s had an incredibly high literacy rate, 70%. Isn't that amazing? And Michelangelo was highly educated. He would have learned Latin. He would have gone to school. But this is where, according to Giorgio Vasari, remember his biographer, Michelangelo starts having these fights with his father. His father wants him to become a notary, wants him to become some kind of a figure that works with his mind. And instead, Michelangelo wants to go into stone carving, the arts. They go back and forth, until finally Michelangelo gets his way because this man, Domenico Ghirlandaio, takes Michelangelo on as an apprentice. And what's so interesting about this, friends, is that Ghirlandaio paid Michelangelo to come and work for him. I mean, really incredible. How old is Michelangelo here? He's 13. He goes off to work for Ghirlandaio. My daughter's 20. She can't even make her bed. Can you imagine? Yeah. So Michelangelo goes off and he's an apprentice for Ghirlandaio, showing us that he must have had some kind of talent that Ghirlandaio would take him on. So what was Ghirlandaio doing during this period in the 1480s? He has a big commission for one of the most important families in Florence, the Tornabuoni, like the Via Tornabuoni, just about across the river. And he's been invited to work here at the Church of Santa Maria Novella at the High Chapel for the Tornabuoni family. And very busy. It's a huge chapel, all done in fresco. Here's an example of what Ghirlandaio was working on. Isn't that lovely? How many of you have seen this? Okay, if you've not, walk across, make sure you visit. This is the famous Birth of the Virgin by Domenico Ghirlandaio, who really would have taught Michelangelo the art of fresco painting. That is, how to mix up intonaco, how to make brushes, how to grind up pigments. And you know what? That's going to be really important when he's got to paint that old ceiling. Remember that ceiling down in Sistine Chapel ceiling? Yes, in fresco. And this is Michelangelo getting his training from Ghirlandaio. Now, some art historians will claim that that frieze there of Putti may have inspired Michelangelo. I think it's Ghirlandaio making quotations, of course, from Luca della Robbia. It's interesting, the whole image. I wouldn't say that the style here of Ghirlandaio would really be a style that is absorbed by Michelangelo, but it's more the teaching of the technique of frescoes that's so important. Instead, the place I think that Michelangelo would have absorbed his style is here. You recognize that? The Brancacci Chapel, which is under restoration right now. We're all waiting with bated breath for it to open up once again. And this is where Masaccio is painting for the Brancacci family in fresco. Now, Masaccio's dead by this point, but certainly Michelangelo can come in and he's looking specifically at the tribute money by Masaccio. Let's read that together. Look at the perspective, the rapport between the figures, the poignancy, the solidity of the figures, the sculptoriality of the figures. Clearly, that's going to inspire Michelangelo. And Michelangelo would have sat, I imagine, in that chapel and sketched what he could, what would have inspired him. Well, gosh, everything. Those are sketches by Michelangelo, taken right from the Brancacci Chapel. So technique, Ghirlandaio, and I think style from Masaccio. Oh, by the way, this is also the place where Michelangelo received his famous busted nose. He was teasing another artist about being an inferior sketcher. His name was Torrigiano. Torrigiano hauled off and popped him one and said, "You're going to carry my autograph for the rest of your life." And he did. And that's how we can find, especially in later Michelangelo works, self-portraits of Michelangelo with a broken nose. All right, well, let's go back to Ghirlandaio. Why is Ghirlandaio important besides teaching Michelangelo technique? Also because he's working for Giovanni Tornabuoni. That's the patron. Giovanni Tornabuoni's sister is married to Piero de' Medici, who is the father of Lorenzo the Magnificent. I'll do that again. Giovanni Tornabuoni is married to Lucrezia. Giovanni Tornabuoni's sister is married to Piero di Cosimo, and their son is Lorenzo the Magnificent. And I wanted to make that link between Ghirlandaio, Tornabuoni, Medici. And here are the Medici at the Sassetti Chapel. This is a painting by Ghirlandaio, where you can see Lorenzo the Magnificent, the fellow on the right-hand side with the very black hair, who's standing at the top of steps with the Medici tutor and children coming up the steps. Here's a nice detail. See those two little kids in the middle? Giovanni and Giulio. Those are the future Pope Leo X and Pope Clement VII. I mean, wow. So that's the period that we're in. And this is how we think Michelangelo comes into the realm of this man, Lorenzo il Magnifico. There's his dates, and that's when he's the head of the family. I love this, this particular painting. It's posthumous. You can see in the background the city of Florence. On your left-hand side, I can see a laurel tree for Lorenzo. And he was truly a remarkable individual. He was truly a humanist. He was the unofficial Prince of Florence, and he is going to recognize the talent of the young Michelangelo and invite him to show him what he can do. This is interesting about Lorenzo the Magnificent. He's not so much a big patron of artists, but he facilitates things very well. It's kind of soft power, right? Let me help you out. Let me hook you up with the right patron. And then it reflects back well on Lorenzo, reflects back well on Florence. And most importantly, if he sets him up in a far-flung place, you spread the Florentine style, just as he did with Leonardo da Vinci, sending him up to Milan. And as the story goes, Michelangelo, the young boy, he's going to carve a marble faun. This is a painting by Giovanni di San Giovanni from the late 16th century, but showing us the marble faun that Michelangelo presents to Lorenzo the Magnificent. I like this painting as well because he's surrounded by artists and sculptors and humanists. He points to Michelangelo and says, that is a wonderful work of art, but if it's an old marble faun, he shouldn't have all of his teeth. Michelangelo very carefully goes in, carves, makes a little hole where his tooth was, knocks out the tooth, makes a hole, presents it to Lorenzo the Magnificent, who thinks he is delightful and invites him to live at the Medici palace. Now, I wouldn't say in the palace, but in one of the properties between here where this slide is taken. This is right next to the side of San Marco, all the way down. So this is Via Cavour today. At that time, it would be called Via Larga. And Michelangelo was invited to live with the Medici. There's even a plaque. Next time you have to catch the number 17 bus, stop and have a look at the plaque that marks where this sculpture garden was that Michelangelo was set free. And here's a drawing of that at the top. And these sculpture drawings were pretty interesting. Here, just giving you an idea of what it would look like. These artists were invited to come to the sculpture garden, and in the sculpture garden on the right-hand side, they would see pieces from classical antiquity. They could copy them, they could present them. They used it as a kind of a way of training. Now Michelangelo's been trained in fresco technique. He's looked at the style of Masaccio, and here he's getting firsthand a look at classical antiquity and trying his hand at it. And here is a reproduction of that famous marble faun. It used to be at the Bargello, but I guess it got stolen at some point. And it's all delightful. Here is the Medici Palace, where Michelangelo is involved from 1490 to 1492. Palazzo Medici, today, of course, Palazzo Medici Riccardi. So who is in the realm of Lorenzo, that humanist at the time? Well, he's got characters such as Angelo Poliziano, Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola. Most of you have heard of these characters. If you've not, these are the great Neoplatonists surrounded in the unofficial court of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And certainly the artists were invited to listen in on this, certainly Botticelli, much of it was centered at Palazzo Medici, but also in the Villa Castello outside of Florence. And we call this the Neoplatonic Society. Again, Michelangelo was well educated. He would have understood this, and it would have inspired him. The other thing that would have inspired him is the structure itself. Here's the courtyard of Palazzo Medici. There's our gray Pietra Serena. It's a wonderful example of early Renaissance architecture. And Michelangelo, age 17, is walking through the courtyard, looks up, and that's what he sees. Did you all see that? I'll do it again. Now, I worked hard on this. So what was in there? It was Donatello's David, for goodness sakes. I mean, the bronze David. And I put it up high because that's how we think it was displayed. Now, of course, Michelangelo's later David is a different story, but I think the idea of the young David, the upstart symbol of the Medici family, but much more before that, the symbol of the city of Florence, must have gotten right into Michelangelo's soul. I always say, I just taught a class last night on Donatello, Michelangelo stands on the shoulders of Donatello. Without Donatello, the Renaissance, as that recent show was named, you would have never gotten to Michelangelo. All right, so who else is at the Medici Palace or working in the Medici sculpture garden? An artist named Bertaldo da Giovanni, who I presume most of you have not heard of. This is a work that's at the Bargello today. It's a very fine bronze sculptor or caster. You can see this kind of battle relief, and I bring him up because he was a student of Donatello, and he was the curator of the Medici sculpture garden. So we have a direct link between Donatello and Michelangelo. Okay, put that all together. And what's the work that comes out of this period? The Madonna of the Stairs. And this is today at the Casa Buonarroti. Beautiful. Here's what it looks like today. Look at the image. This is about a slide from around 5 years ago. And now here it is, recently cleaned, paid for by the Friends of Florence, who did a beautiful job with the restoration of this, the Madonna of the Stairs. And we date this between 1490 and 1492, when Michelangelo is working with the Medici. Presumably, he's working on this in the Medici sculpture garden. It's an unusual piece, very small, looks a little bit like a Greek stele. Okay, let's read that together. What's the iconography? We've got the Virgin Mary holding Christ with some children at the top of a staircase and a balustrade coming down the center. And that's been interpreted as Mary, of course, holding Christ, the children in the background, angels who are playing with the shroud of Christ. Let's go deeper. She's seated on a rock. The word in Italian for rock is Pietra, Peter. Upon you I shall build my church. She holds the Christ child close to her womb. In the background, you can see these stairs. At the time, there was a publication called The 5 Steps to Paradise through Maria, M-A-R-I-A. That's a possibility for the meaning behind the stairs. That's the iconographical interpretation. I just think it's a Madonna and child sitting in front of a staircase. Maybe it's going a little bit too far with that iconography. It's also an interesting piece because you can see that some parts of this are awkward and some parts of it are quite skillful. Okay, look at it. So what looks awkward to you? Yeah, look at the foot, the lower, her right foot is turned in a difficult way. I wonder if I can do this. I don't have a cursor. Hang on a second. I should be able to get in close. There. See that? Unusual. He hasn't really finished up that foot. Then the staircase, in fact, is also very flat. Then you look at this giant hand of the Virgin. I'll get in closer. Here she goes. A little bit awkward. Also, the treatment of the legs of those young angels coming down, they remind me of flattened butterflies on the surface. However, the skillful parts really come out. I love the position of Christ with his back to us, very muscular, the arm tucked behind, beginning this swirl of activity from the bent neck of Christ to his arm, to the hand and around again, and also the treatment of the drapery. Beautifully done, very low relief, which should remind us immediately of Donatello. So here's the Madonna of the Clouds. That's in Boston. Again, it's called rilievo schiacciato or crushed relief. Let's get a little bit closer and do that compare contrast. Millimeters here that Donatello has very carefully carved in to give us the sense of space and gentleness. And I think that Michelangelo has tried to emulate that same technique. So that's from 1492, about the same time. At the same period, Michelangelo does this. Wow, could not be less similar. This is called the battle relief. It's called the Battle of the Lapis and Centaurs. It's also at the Casa Buonarroti. And according to Giorgio Vasari, Michelangelo took this story from Angelo Poliziano, right, the humanist, who told him this story about the Battle of the Lapis and Centaurs. Lapis are a tribe of peoples, and centaurs are half horse, half man. And the Lapis made a big mistake. They invited centaurs to a wedding. Whatever you do, friends, don't invite centaurs to your wedding. They make a big mess, and their bestial side comes up. And sure enough, you have this whole activity or battle scene going on. It's a wonderful excuse for Michelangelo to show nude figures in action with this very, very deep relief. Now, I'll help you look at this. In the very center, you can see the centaur, and he has his arm up, and around you get this whole series of circles to the far end. Let's take a look at where Michelangelo may have gotten the idea from. I think it's clear that it's taken from a Roman sarcophagus. Where could he have seen a Roman sarcophagus? Probably in the collection of the Medici Sculpture Yard. Okay, so this gives us the very earliest Michelangelos, and here he's, 17 years old, looking to Donatello and looking specifically to classical antiquity, getting his training. Now, it's about this time that he also goes to the Church of Santo Spirito and begins doing dissection of human cadavers. The Augustinians look the other way. Michelangelo and Leonardo and Verrocchio were doing dissection of human cadavers because they were interested in how the body works. And according to Vasari, in thanks for this, Michelangelo carved a wooden crucifix. And this is one of the most hotly debated statues by Michelangelo. Some art historians say it's Michelangelo, some say no way. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say later, whether you think it's Michelangelo or not, Professor. It is wood, which is unusual to say the least for Michelangelo. The idea, and it also kind of reappeared on the scene only in the 1970s. It had been lost or in a storehouse, found again and placed on display. It was at the Casa Buonarroti, and now it's back at Santo Spirito. Whenever I teach this painting, again, I like to look at the aspects that seem like Michelangelo and seem unlikely. What's unlikely is the wood. It's by Michelangelo. It's the only wooden work by Michelangelo. Also, how slight the figure is, and that it is colored, painted. Look at the blood on the side of Christ, his hair. You can see a plaque on top written in 3 languages, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, the kind of slimness. And again, he's only 17 years old. And what looks like Michelangelo to me is, of course, the nudity of the figure and that kind of lovely, graceful turn of the figure as well. So I will leave that to you to decide. We think he did do the crucifix for Santo Spirito, but whether it's this one or not, we won't know. It's very lovely. I think it is not Michelangelo, but it is certainly belonging to some of the great wooden crucifixes of the late 15th century. Donatello, Brunelleschi, Sansovino, and maybe Michelangelo. All right, that brings me right to the year 1492. What a wonderful time to be alive. Lorenzo the Magnificent, he's got an eye towards Rome. He's got such an eye towards Rome that he manages to get his second son, Giovanni, made a cardinal. And that kid is going to grow up, as I already said, to become Pope Leo X. 1492. Lots going on in 1492. Who in this room can tell me what happens in 1492? Thank you. Columbus sails the ocean blue for the Americans. That's a big deal. The discovery of America. How about Lorenzo dies? Anybody else? Jews are expelled from Spain. Spanish Inquisition. The Borgia Pope comes on the scene. And most importantly for Michelangelo's life, of course, we have the death of Lorenzo. Here are the other events. Christopher Columbus, the expulsion of the Jews, Spanish Inquisition, and this great light of the Renaissance, the unofficial Prince of Florence, dies in 1492, and his son takes over, better known as Piero the Unfortunate. Doesn't know what he's doing. He's only 17 years old. He was certainly not the man that his father was. I think he must have taken after his mother more than his father. And he messes up the family business, to say the least. He also panics when this man, Charles VIII, he has a claim on Naples, and he begins his march from France down to Naples. And of course, that threatens the city of Florence. He marches into Florence in 1492. Of course, Lorenzo's son, Piero the Unfortunate, he panics, and eventually the Medici get kicked out of the city. That's going to be their second exile. And this is, to say the least, disastrous, coming together with what we just talked about, the different voyages of Christopher Columbus, looking towards. So why is that important for Italy? Well, I mean, I know that Christopher Columbus is an Italian, right? So is Marco Polo, so is Giovanni Verrazzano, so is John Cabot. But who's paying for this? Anybody? Yeah, Spain, exactly. So this marks this moment of a decline in the importance of the Italian city-states, because now the Italians are fat and lazy. They're sitting back on their laurels, and instead the power is going to rise up undoubtedly to be Spain, then eventually the Dutch and England, and the age of discovery. And it's all right there. By 1494, what happens? Vasco da Gama gets around the Cape of Good Hope, and the Peace of Lodi, which was forged by Lorenzo the Magnificent's grandfather, Cosimo de' Medici, is going to end with the entrance of the French king. He managed to broker a peace, friends, from 1434 to 1494 between all of these different houses, the Florence, Milan, Venice, Mantova, Ferrara, and that period of peace, of course, led to this great period of an outgrowth of art and architecture. So at the end of that, you can imagine, came great strife. Michelangelo in 1492, he's going to take off. He's going to take off, and he makes his way to Bologna. Little known fact. Goes to Bologna, basically just to get out of town. He ends up staying there for a year, and he works at the Church of San Domenico. Just wanted to show you this because it's a very beautiful little piece by Michelangelo. Most people don't realize that there are 3 Michelangelos in Bologna. He's working on the tomb of Saint Dominic that was started by Niccolo dell'Arca. Isn't that lovely? Lovely little angel, style of Jacopo della Quercia. Michelangelo comes in to help finish it and does a statue of San Petronio on your left and this little Hercules figure on the right. Look at that figure. Weights on his right leg, left leg is relaxed, holding something in his hand. What does that remind you of? Yeah, it's a little mini David, and then this beautiful candle holder of this boy angel on the arca. So that's what Michelangelo does. And finally, he gets the big call. He gets down to Rome at this point. This is his first Roman sojourn. Florence at this point is going downhill, and Michelangelo takes off to Rome to try to make his fortune. I can't even imagine what he thought about Rome in 1494. Coming through what must have been the hinterland, Roma disabitato was known as. And he goes down to work for these two men. The guy on your left with the circle is Cardinal Riario, and on your right, Jacopo Galli. But most importantly, the fellow on the far right is Pope Sixtus IV. Cardinal Riario is his nephew, and Jacopo Galli is his secretary and friend, and they invite Michelangelo to create a statue that belonged in the sculpture garden of Cardinal Riario. This is called the Cancelleria in Rome today, and his sculpture garden, we think, would have looked like this. So the idea is interesting. Was Michelangelo making a statue that was supposed to look like something from classical antiquity? And that's where this comes in. You recognize it? Yeah, this is at the Bargello. It's often overlooked, but the more you study it, the more interesting it becomes. There are parts of it that look antique and parts of it that show us already the genius of Michelangelo. Giorgio Vasari tells us that he rubbed dirt all over it, knocked off the penis, so it looks as if it was just excavated from the ground. But that's a Vasari story. So let's read this together. It's the god Bacchus, and it's over life size. And you can tell it's Bacchus. He's wearing grapes in his hair. He offers us out a cup of wine. He also holds a lion skin holding grapes. And if you look at him from the front, he's reeling back, unbalanced, looking very, he's also fleshy, like someone who drinks a lot of wine. In fact, he's also powerful. I think what Michelangelo is interested in here is starting to move the figure. There's a contrapposto or a weight shift going on, but he's also asking us to begin to move around the figure. And he does so by changing the views. It's a frontal view. And here's a nice close-up of the face. You won't see Michelangelo be this detailed later on. See how carefully he's drilled in to give us the grapes, and he even has teeth and eyebrows and eyeballs, and again, looks dead drunk. Walking around him from the side, you get a whole different perspective with this little satyr. Satyr is half goat, half boy, who's munching on grapes held in a lion skin. And I think that's where the genius of Michelangelo comes out at this tender age. Here he's only 21 years old. He's munching, you can almost hear him munching on those grapes. And the figure twists around the body of Bacchus, holding up the figure, but also creating a new kind of twist that we can call figura serpentinata, or the serpentine figure. And that's Michelangelo getting to Rome. Interestingly enough, Cardinal Riario didn't accept it, and it ends up in the collection of Jacopo Galli. But it gets Michelangelo to Rome, and here's the big break, coming to this wonderful crescendo. He gets a commission from a French cardinal for his funerary chapel at Santa Petronilla. This is Old St. Peter's, so before it gets transformed under Julius II. And San Petronilla is the centralized building on the left-hand side. And the French cardinal wanted to have a Pieta for his tomb. And he would have been used to something like this. So what's a Pieta? It's an apocryphal moment where Mary and Christ are brought together for one last time, typically Northern European. The one on the right is German, the one on the left is French. And it's a difficult theme because how do you get a 33-year-old man in the lap of a 50-year-old woman without it looking awkward? And it does look awkward, no? But the emphasis here is on the grief, the suffering, the pathos of the figures. Michelangelo takes on this project, goes to Carrara, which is in the Apuan Mountains, where you have perfect statuary marble. chose his block of marble from Carrara, brings it to Rome, and carves what might be the most beautiful statue in Western art history. What do you think? Yeah, I'm sure you've all seen this. Unfortunately, today we see it from behind bulletproof glass because a crazy person in 1972 tried to attack it with a hammer, knocked off the nose, the hand, and part of the back of the head of the Pieta. But here we can see, thanks to the power of PowerPoint, a nice close-up of it. And he solves the problem, doesn't he? Of the 50-year-old woman and the 33-year-old man by making, look carefully, Mary enormous. If she stood up, she'd be what, 8 feet tall? Yeah. Can you see that? But unless I point it out, it doesn't become immediately apparent because Michelangelo synthesizes those figures so beautifully together by using 2 geometric shapes, the triangle from Mary, her head, to her finger, to the foot of Christ, to the bottom of Golgotha, back up again to the head of Christ, to the apex of Mary, and then Christ forms this wonderful oval around her. She is a closing figure, he is an opening figure, this kind of harmony of opposites. And Michelangelo, with great care and detail, carves and shines every millimeter of this statue in a completion that we'll never see him do again. I always like to think of it as his calling card. This is what I got. This is what I can do. Beautiful. Also, the passages here just knock me out when I look at this, for example. See the curve here of the drapery, which echoes the limp wrist of Christ and these tips of his finger, and then this pulsing wrist of the Virgin Mary. Beautifully done. Also, you can just make out the wound of Christ here in his bicep. You can also make out the vein. Here's Mary's face. Isn't she beautiful? She looks more like a Botticelli, doesn't she, than Michelangelo. And Michelangelo was actually criticized for this because, after all, she certainly doesn't look 50, does she? She looks about 16. And Michelangelo got around the criticism by quipping, "Virgins don't age." Yeah, Michelangelo was a son of a gun. And here's a nice detail. It's the only signed work of art as well. Giorgio Vasari tells us that he crept in the middle of the night and signed it across that banner across her, like a Miss America sash going across her body. I mean, that's a Vasari story, but certainly it is signed. And it says, Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this. That's why I think it is very much like a calling card. Here's just some of the tools he would have used for carving that for carving the beautiful Pieta, working from the claw, the chisel, the flat edge chisel, finer and finer gradations of files, sandpaper, and then beating the thing with hay and then with suede to bring up that beautiful shine. Brings out the calcium from the calcium carbonate in the marble. And it remains today one of the most beautiful figures from Western art history. All right, so bringing this all together in this last 5 minutes. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. What's going on in Florence while Michelangelo is carving that Pieta and the Bacchus? Well, Florence is now under the grips of this man, who is a fanatical Dominican monk whose name is Savonarola. He came on the scene when Lorenzo the Magnificent was alive, preached eventually against the Medici. He called Florence Sin City, like the Las Vegas of Italy, and preached against these sinful practices of wealthy merchants. Here in this 19th century image of Savonarola, he's so popular, he's preaching inside the Cathedral of Florence, and on the lower side, you can see golden plates and dice and playing cards and sumptuous brocades. He would take all of those and tell his piangione, his young followers, better known as the big crybabies, would come, collect these objects and throw them into the bonfire of the vanities. You've all heard that term, no? Thomas Mann used it. Bonfire of the vanities, what would go in? Here's my list. Covered buttons, for some reason, he was against. But of course, books, Boccaccio, and then Savonarola goes too far. He calls the Pope the Antichrist. That is just plain dumb, especially because the Pope at the time was Alexander the Sixth. He was a Borgia Pope. And Borgia excommunicates the entire city of Florence. Now, that gets Florence in their pocketbook, because if you're excommunicated and you're a banker, any loan that's owed you is forgiven. So immediately the Florentine business people come together and they give up Savonarola, I think, very quickly, and he was hanged and burned in the year 1498. So this image I'm showing you, do you recognize it? Okay, we're right here in Piazza della Signoria on your right side. And here is Savonarola, who's being brought to justice. Here's a nice detail. And hanged and burned. Now, I'm telling you this story for a specific reason, because now, after the death of Savonarola, the Florentines formed a new government with a new mayor named Pietro Soderini, and things change. Florence forms a new republic without the Medici. Michelangelo comes home, and he is commissioned to do the David. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Elaine. So as always, I hope we can get the Zoom people back. Let's see if we on share here. No, that's not working. Sarah, if you can hear me, can you get this, open up the Zoom? They're here, but not on our screen.
I'm sorry, I didn't know they left.
Yeah, we can see them on here, but not on the big screen. Okay. Whilst we're getting the Zoomers to join us, we'll, as is our practice, we'll now open up the questions and answers. So if you want to ask a question in the room, put your hand up and I'll bring the microphone to you so that people on the Zoom can hear. And if you're on the Zoom and you want to talk to us, you can put it in the chat, or you can even unmute yourself and talk to us. Here we are, we can see you now. There they are, they're all here. Fantastic. Right. And there's some lights as well. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I think I saw somebody here who wanted to get started. Is that right? No, I misunderstood. We got one in front.
So, thank you very much. Just fascinating lecture. In the Church of Our Lady in Bruges, there's an early work of Michelangelo, a lovely Madonna with Child. What is known about that?
Should we get this one going? Then you can use that.
That's easy.
Yeah.
So that beautiful work in Bruges, one of the loveliest, would date just around the period of the David. And one idea is that it belonged to a family called the Piccolomini. Michelangelo also was commissioned to work for the Piccolomini in Siena. He does 2 statues in the Cathedral of Siena, and we think that that Bruges Madonna might have been meant for that. And, you know, it's interesting because that is the only statue by Michelangelo outside of Italy, unless you count the statue in New York. Oh, yes, of course. The dying slaves, yeah. It's a beautiful work. Have you all seen the one in Bruges? Yeah, really, really lovely.
Elaine, there's a bunch of questions in the chat which you might take yourself. Just read them out if you can. Yeah. Can you see them or not? What do you want to do it for you?
Okay, so Kim says, I know Botticelli got sucked in by Savonarola and burned some of his own paintings. How did Michelangelo react to Savonarola? We're not sure 100%, Kim, about that. That's the rumor that Botticelli did this. Michelangelo's reaction to Savonarola, it's interesting. I don't think he had anything to say about that, but you know, his brother was involved with Savonarola, was a follower of Savonarola. And certainly Michelangelo could have heard some of those sermons by Michelangelo. Why were the bodies to dissect at Santo Spirito? The bodies were there. They were mostly criminals and maybe unknown bodies. And the Augustinians, who were quite forward thinking, were a little bit more permissive about it. Thank you, Barbara. Okay, lots of thank yous and well done's. Okay.
There's Cardinal Riario. Was the Cardinal Riario the same one who led the mass in Florence when the Pazzi conspiracy happened?
Yes. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. I didn't see that one. And the same Pope, Sixtus IV, And when you think about how quickly Lorenzo even kind of makes up with him, even though, what he did to his brother is unforgettable. I think it was all about diplomacy.
There certainly was a power struggle going on
Mamma mia.
amongst many. All right, so another one here. Yeah.
Thank you for a fabulous talk. Do we know much about Michelangelo's personality? What sort of person he was to engage with as a young man and then as he grew older?
We don't know so much about what he was like as a young man, but we do know as an older man. It's a wonderful book written by William Wallace, where he goes through and he really dissects all the letters, and he's able to surmise what Michelangelo was like. And he wasn't very nice. He was very quick to anger. He was very jealous. He was insulting. We know that he was insulting to Leonardo, almost needlessly so. Also to Raphael, he was quick to anger. He was very proud, as he should have been. But on the other hand, he was quite kind to his assistants, and he took care of them. So not someone I would want to be in competition with. But if I were under his umbrella, I think about his protege, Sebastiano del Piombo, there was great love there. And of course, there was great love. Not sure if it was physical love, but certainly it was a great, deep emotional love to a man named Tommaso Cavaliere, who he did gorgeous drawings for. And he also loved very much Vittoria Colonna. Again, this is in the latter part of his career. As a young man, I don't think we can surmise it, but as an older man, contentious, quick to anger, but also, I think, a soft side.
Just on the pause, I'm going to ask Sarah, if you can hear me, to put up in the chat the link for those who want to subscribe to the What's On weekly newsletter, because I think we might have some first-timers with us tonight.
Let me just answer this one. Penny's writing, did Michelangelo knew Latin? According to William Wallace, yes. Frederick Hart said little or no Latin. Frederick Hart wrote that book on Michelangelo many, many years ago. So maybe, I don't think there's a controversy. We're pretty sure he knew what he was doing.
Did he write his poems in Latin or in vernacular?
No, those were written in Italian. Beautiful Florentine.
Okay, another question from the room. We got anyone want to raise a hand? Anyone on the Zoom? Got any more coming in? So does somebody want to talk to us on the Zoom? Someone unmute. We'll hear you in the room. No? Nobody wants to talk to us. Okay. I will also remind the Zoomers that we invite you to attend by Zoom free of charge, but we also like it when you give us a little donation for however much you feel comfortable with, and so we'll put up the link so you can do that. It is greatly appreciated as we need all the help we can get to keep this beautiful place going.
And it is a beautiful place.
Thank you, Elaine. Yeah, it's very nice to have you back here.
Yeah, lovely.
Don't be a stranger. So do you have more questions or thoughts in the room? Yeah, we've got one over here.
Would you say more about the relationship between Da Vinci and Michelangelo, and how much of it was personality versus, because apparently Da Vinci was very charming and attractive, and
Right.
that doesn't seem like that describes Michelangelo. And
Right. So remember, Leonardo's older than Michelangelo. Leonardo is about 20 years older than Michelangelo. And I don't think he regarded Michelangelo so much when they were young, but Michelangelo will say rude things to him. For example, he'll say, you paint like a girl, which I guess them's fighting words, but they really were set up. They were both recognized, obviously, as great talents at the time. And in 1502, they're both set up to paint inside the Palazzo Vecchio. And Michelangelo is to paint the Battle of Cascina, and Leonardo the Battle of Anghiari. And it was always meant to be the great paragone, the great comparison. And Michelangelo would often say, I'm a sculptor, I'm not a painter. But of course, he picks up the challenge and tried to, dealing with Leonardo. Leonardo never came to pass because Leonardo, of course, painted an experimental method, didn't stay on the wall. Michelangelo only made a huge cartoon that, of course, was copied and looked at so much that people loved it to death, literally, and Leonardo will go up to Milan. But I think the relationship between them was more of, and again, this is my opinion, I can't say this for sure, but it seems to me that Michelangelo was trying to live up to Leonardo and outdo him. And Leonardo might have looked at Michelangelo a little bit like a bit of a puppy trying to find his way. And also just the way the two characters were so interesting. I mean, Leonardo was an anomaly. Think about it. You know, he was illegitimate. He was left-handed. He was gay. He was a vegetarian. He wore purple and pink. You know, what a great guy. No, very lovable. He was very good looking. And Michelangelo was cranky and jealous and miserly. So I think that the two make a very interesting comparison. There was a book, I guess, written about 5 or 6 years ago called Oil and Marble. Yeah, I haven't read it. Was it good? I don't remember. So.
How much of it was true or not, but
Yeah.
it's fantastic read. I read it on the flight out here when I first
did you?
moved, when I
Okay,
first
great,
moved here. It's amazing.
I can't remember the author. Maybe you do, but it's
I
called
can't.
Oil and Marble. I read some reviews. Some of it said it was a little bit, fictitious, but that's okay. That's okay too.
Well,
Right.
there's always the agony and the ecstasy if you want to
There you go.
to the real truth.
I think
Yeah.
today, I think, and again, maybe you agree with me, Cecilia, that the great expert of Michelangelo is considered William Wallace right now. He's seems to be at the top of his game as the great Michelangelo scholar.
Last year was published a book from Horst Bredekamp. I don't know if you know it. It's like
Epic.
10 tons. And I think that's a very, very good new monography on Michelangelo.
Yeah, it's just incredible.
Horst Bredekamp.
It's incredible how people are drawn to Michelangelo. We just can't get enough of him. And just when you think that it's been exhausted, the resource, something else wonderful comes out.
There's our friend Alan Pascuzzi had written a book in which he talks about being Michelangelo's apprentice because he spent so much time copying Michelangelo's drawings. He was in the British Library, I think, and he was given access to the drawings and then left alone. And he thought, should I steal one? But no, he just stuck with copying them. But you're right, the influence of Michelangelo is everywhere. I think I saw another hand up the back there.
I was just interested to know if you know how much he was compensated for these big, important young works.
Yeah, we like for the young works. We do know what he made for the David. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we do know what he earned for the David, for the Sistine Chapel, what he was paid. It was, he became incredibly wealthy. I don't know, however, how much he made for those early works. Yeah, well, certainly he would have been paid at least 10 times more than his contemporaries, and much more than Leonardo as well, for that matter. Again, the Buonarroti family didn't work for the next 300 years. That's incredible.
I think we got some further messages in the Zoom which we need to check out. If I can get over there.
I got it.
You get it. Unless we're trying to find the Zoom. Charles, good.
So they want to know if you'll have this as a recording.
Yes.
Sheila says she's sitting in Kent, wishing she was in Florence. Yeah, that's all we got.
Hello, Elaine.
How are
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Looks like Simon was looking for somebody else to ask a question, so I'll venture this. I have sort of a bit of a theory, and I'd be delighted to hear what you think of it. Why is Michelangelo raised above everybody else at the time he was? Brilliant, wonderful, but so are a lot of the others around him. So in this period of the beginning of humanism, and we have around the Medici, around Lorenzo the Magnificent, basically they're immensely wealthy and powerful, they're young, they don't want to live lives like their grandparents. The world is changing. They want to get away with these new ideas that are dangerous in a very orthodox, powerfully Christian environment. And Michelangelo gets away with things because he's so good. And so they have a I think, and raising him up, and he becomes a banner behind which they can march in a way. If he gets away with it, he's getting away with their ideas, the ideas they want to have.
So I think there's some truth to that, and I agree. But why is Michelangelo raised up and considered better than anybody else at the time? I would say that's a multi-part answer, one of which is he was really good. I mean, the David, let's face it. I mean, all of us walk in and way beyond. Also, at the time, the patrons, the people who were paying for it, as you said, taste was being led by Lorenzo the Magnificent, the great taste maker, and the patrons want to lift him up because Julius II will hire him and lift him up as this great paradigm. And also, I think that he does look back to classical antiquity and plays to that. And people want to think of themselves. Florence liked to think of herself as a new Athens on the Arno, right? Florence, daughter of Rome. And Michelangelo plays right into that role. And then lastly, Giorgio Vasari has a huge role in playing this. I mean, remember, he wrote that biography in Michelangelo's lifetime. Michelangelo has one of the distinctions to have 2 biographies written about him during his lifetime. I think that might be the first time that happens to anybody. I mean, we're talking about the 16th century, right? Can you think of another example? And therefore, Vasari, who's such a taste maker, and puts Michelangelo at the apex of that. So I would say patronage, writings, classical antiquity, and he was bloody good.
And Vasari was something of a Medici propagandist as well. I mean, that was as well. Yeah.
Sorry, I just have to ask. He was obviously so brilliant with bodies and he understood them because he dissected them. Why are the women and the Sistine Chapel so male, so masculine, so huge and muscular?
Michelangelo has one theme and one theme only, the male nude. For him, that's the utmost beauty. And he, no matter, I mean, just even when he paints, think about the Doni Tondo at the Uffizi. That's a man with breasts placed on, or the Medici Chapel, same thing. He's not interested in landscape like Leonardo. He's not really interested in backgrounds, or he just is interested in the body, the male body. I mean, I know the Pieta is that's an early figure, but I think that's an exception to, and then as he goes on, remember Michelangelo, again, those 3 parts of his life, the further you get into that last third of his life, the more exaggerated and overdone the figures are. I mean, does he really think that those figures with all the, Leonardo said that to avoid showing too many muscles, or you look like you're painting a sack of nuts, just to give you an idea between the two. But Michelangelo found that beautiful. I think that was his own taste. Yeah, fascinating. Good question.
What's the latest scholarship on whether he was gay or not?
I think that I don't think we can guess or say for sure, but I think it's pretty clear that he had some kind of a relationship with Tommaso Cavaliere. But
and not a lot of obvious women in his life.
His mother died when he was so young. He only mentions his mother once in his whole life, in a letter where he recommended to his nephew to call the newborn baby Francesca after his mother. That's it. Freud has a really good time with that. He really does. Yeah.
Why the rhymes of Michelangelo are so unknown? We rarely know his extraordinary ability in being a poet also. Why that?
I think that's art historians' fault, because we're more interested in the painting, the sculpture, and the architecture. And poetry is difficult. And also it's in Florentine, so it's especially difficult unless you're Italian. But it's beautiful. There's been wonderful things written about his poetry. Really lovely. Lorenzo the Magnificent was a fine poet as well. Very fine. Thank you.
Question from Jennifer Skeeping on the Zoom. No, so it's Liz Loveland quoting Jennifer. Any comments on the story of Michelangelo reciting Dante for his supper whilst in Bologna? Do you know?
Yeah, I do. That's the funny story that Michelangelo goes to Bologna, and the Bolognese, I can't remember the name of the family, and I'll come to me in a minute. They were so excited to have Michelangelo and two of his friends in Bologna because they wanted Michelangelo to recite Dante in Florentine. And so he entertained them that way. And then the patron, his name will come to me in just 1 minute, said to Michelangelo, get rid of those two friends of yours. They're just dragging you down. And Michelangelo dumped the friends and stayed in Bologna for a year doing that lovely San Domenico arc. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if it's true or not. It's a Vasari story, but it's a good story. Wouldn't you love to hear Michelangelo reciting Dante? I would.
A good story. It's a good story. Yeah. Is anyone on the Zoom want to unmute and talk to us? Because we'd love to hear your voices from across the airwaves. And I hope the sound quality has been good for you. Roger, talk to us.
Hello. Well, I seem to remember learning from somewhere, I think Kenneth Clark in Civilization or one of his books, he shows a sculpture that looks like Michelangelo as a boy, whether it was a self-portrait or it was by somebody else. I wonder if you could tell us anything about that.
Which statue?
Is it a self-portrait of the boy?
Of Michelangelo as a boy. It looks like him, and it's got that sort of fearsome look of Michelangelo look, of the terribilità, even at the age of about 14.
Gosh.
You don't know that one?
No, I don't know. I know the self-portraits of Michelangelo when he's an older man. When at the Last Judgment, he uses his own face for the face of the skin of Saint Bartholomew. On the Florence Pieta, perhaps in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is one other idea, but I don't know an image of him when he was young. I'm sorry, Roger.
Yeah, Roger, maybe.
I think it was doubtful whether it was him or by him or anything. So there we are. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe the fawn looks, but the fawn he does when he's a kid.
Yeah.
Right, but if the fawn is such an old, ugly figure, it can't be a self-portrait.
Roger, maybe if you can pick up the reference somewhere and send it to us, we'll
all right.
look into it further.
I'll see what I can do. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Okay, we're heading towards closing time. So any last thoughts from the room or from the Zoom? Going. There's one coming. How old when he did the fawn again? I think he
would have been.
Oh, I think he means St. Proculus.
About 17. He means the son. Okay, that's interesting, Andrea.
Yeah.
Doesn't really look like Michelangelo. I have to look at that again. The one in Bologna.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think on that sort of slight hesitation, we'll bring this comprehensive and detailed survey of Michelangelo's young life to an end. Thank you very much indeed, Elaine.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. And if you want more of Elaine online, she's there every Sunday talking currently about Venice. So look it up on elaineruffolo.com or whatever. It's all easy to find, and also through our What's On. And anyone on the Zoom or here who wants more of our Wednesday lectures, they happen every Wednesday. The clue is in the name. And so we'll see you all next week. Now, as is our wont, those who are here in Palazzo Lanfredini in our beautiful library will now go next door for the beautiful glass of Coloniale wine. Coloniale are from Rufina, our wine partners this month. So we still haven't figured out how to do virtual wine, but you can console yourselves with your own supplies. Marjorie's already on it, I can see. Yeah. All right. Anyhow, thanks so much for being with us, and we'll see you all soon. Virtually, hopefully, eventually here in Florence. All right. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Actually, translate is actually open.
Yeah, I was